Alright, let's break down the key aspects of polar bears. 1. Habitat and distribution. Polar bears Ursus maritimus are found in the Arctic Circle, encompassing the Arctic Ocean, its surrounding seas, and surrounding land. They prefer coastal areas where the sea ice is present, as they rely on sea ice for hunting. As the ice melts due to climate change, polar bears are increasingly found further inland or near the coast, which can be problematic for their hunting. 2. Adaptations to cold. Polar bears are incredibly well adapted to the harsh Arctic environment.
They have thick fur.
Their fur is dense and acts as an insulating layer. The fur also appears white, which helps camouflage them in the snow. A thick layer of fat. Beneath their fur, they have a thick layer of fat that provides insulation against the cold. This layer can be up to 4.5 inches, 11 centimeters thick. Large paws. Their paws are large and act like snowshoes, helping them walk across ice without sinking. The pads on their feet are also covered in fur to reduce heat loss. Black skin. Beneath their fur, polar bears have black skin, which absorbs and retains heat from the sun. 3. Diet and hunting. Polar bears are carnivores and are primarily dependent on seals for food, especially ringed seals and bearded seals. They are excellent swimmers and use sea ice to hunt. They often hunt by wading near breathing holes or breaking through thin ice to catch seals. They also have a keen sense of smell and can detect seals nearly a mile away and beneath several feet of compacted snow and ice. Their diet mainly consists of seal blubber, which provides the high-fat content they need to survive in such a cold climate. Polar bears can fast for long periods when food is scarce, especially during the summer when sea ice is less prevalent. For behavior and social structure. Solitary nature. Polar bears are mostly solitary animals, except during the mating season or when a mother is raising her cubs. Males and females only come together to mate, typically between April and June. Cubs. Female polar bears give birth to their cubs in dens made of snow, where they remain for several months. Cubs are born small and helpless, but they grow quickly, often emerging in the spring. Territoriality. While they don't maintain strict territories, polar bears do establish home ranges that they use for hunting and migration. 5. Conservation status. Polar bears are listed as vulnerable by the International Union for Conservation of Nature (IUCN). Their main threat is the loss of sea ice due to climate change. As the ice melts, polar bears have to travel further and expend more energy to find food, and their hunting grounds are increasingly being reduced. Climate change. The biggest concern is that warmer temperatures are reducing sea ice, which is critical for hunting. In some areas, the ice is breaking up earlier in the spring and forming later in the fall, leaving polar bears with less time to hunt. Human interaction. There are also concerns about human-bear interactions, as polar bears move closer to human settlements in search of food. Additionally, oil exploration and shipping in the Arctic can disturb their habitat. 6. Role in culture and symbolism. Polar bears are significant in the cultures of Arctic indigenous peoples, such as the Inuit. They are seen as symbols of strength and endurance. In modern times, polar bears have also become symbols for climate change, awareness, and environmental conservation. 7. Research and conservation efforts. Several organizations are working to protect polar bears and their habitats. These efforts include monitoring populations, creating protected areas, and addressing climate change through policy and conservation initiatives. For instance, international agreements like the Polar Bear Agreement 1973 help protect their habitat and manage their populations across borders. Absolutely. Let's dive deeper into each of the key areas. 1. Habitat and distribution detailed. Arctic habitat. Polar bears are the world's largest land carnivores, and their range extends throughout the Arctic, including parts of Canada, Greenland, Norway, Svalbard, Russia, and Alaska. They are closely associated with sea ice, which they use as a platform for hunting seals, migrating, and mating. Migration patterns. Due to the seasonal nature of sea ice, polar bears are often forced to migrate long distances between different sea ice regions in search of food. Their movements are often tied to the shifting ice, and they travel over vast areas, sometimes crossing hundreds of kilometers. Impact of melting ice. In recent decades, due to global warming, the ice is melting at a faster rate. In some areas, polar bears are now forced to remain on land for extended periods, where food is scarcer. This impacts their ability to reproduce and maintain healthy body conditions. 2. Adaptations to cold. Detailed. Fur structure. A polar bear's fur is made up of two layers, a dense undercoat that traps air for insulation, and longer guard hairs that provide protection against the wind. The guard hairs are hollow and act as insulation, reflecting UV rays and helping to regulate body temperature. Interestingly, while polar bear's fur looks white, it's actually translucent, giving them the appearance of being white in snowy environments. Fat storage and insulation. Polar bear's fat layer, also known as blubber, is essential not just for insulation but as a source of energy during times when food is scarce. Their blubber accounts for a significant percentage of their body weight, and it's crucial for surviving long periods without food, especially during the summer months when ice-free waters force them to fast. Heat conservation. Despite their thick fur and fat, polar bears can still overheat if exerting themselves too much, or if the weather is warmer than usual. They've been observed to reduce their activity during the warmer summer months to avoid overheating. They also have large paws with fur-covered soles that help insulate against the cold ground, while providing a surface area to help with thermal regulation. 3. Diet and hunting detailed. Hunting technique. Polar bears are opportunistic hunters. They primarily hunt seals, especially ringed and bearded seals, but they will also scavenge whale carcasses, walruses, and other marine mammals if the opportunity arises. One of their most effective techniques is waiting for seals to surface at breathing holes in the ice. The polar bear will quietly approach these holes, sometimes standing still for hours, before striking at the unsuspecting seal when it emerges. Adapted teeth and claws. Polar bears have powerful jaws and large, sharp teeth designed to rip through thick blubber and flesh. Their claws are strong and curved, enabling them to break through the ice and hold on to prey. Fat-heavy diet. When a polar bear catches a seal, they prefer to eat the blubber first, which is highly caloric and provides essential energy. Polar bears are capable of fasting for months, living off the fat stores they accumulate during hunting seasons. However, without sufficient fat, polar bears may experience malnutrition and lose body mass. For behavior and social structure detailed. Mating and reproduction. Polar bears have a low reproductive rate. Females usually give birth to twins, although single or triplet cubs are also possible. Mating occurs during the spring months April to June, but after mating, females may delay implantation of the fertilized egg for several months until they are in good condition, typically after they've built up sufficient fat reserves for pregnancy. Denning. During pregnancy, female polar bears dig dens into the snow and ice, where they will remain for several months, giving birth and nursing their cubs in relative safety. The cubs are born small, blind, and helpless, weighing around 1 to 1.5 pounds, 0.5 to 0.7 kilograms. Over the next few months, the mother stays in the den, conserving energy and protecting her cubs until they are strong enough to emerge. Solitary nature. While polar bears do not form packs or family groups, mothers and cubs stay together for 2 to 3 years. During this time, the mother teaches her cubs vital survival skills, including hunting techniques and the importance of conserving energy. Male polar bears tend to roam alone, only encountering females during mating season. 5. Conservation status detailed. Vulnerable status. According to the IUCN, polar bears are classified as vulnerable. This status is largely due to the threat posed by climate change, which is affecting their habitat. As sea ice diminishes, polar bears are forced to move closer to human settlements in search of food, increasing human-wildlife conflicts. Hunting and poaching. Though hunting polar bears is illegal in many areas, there are still some places where polar bears are hunted for their pelts, bones, and other body parts. Indigenous groups are permitted to hunt them in certain regions, but this is often strictly regulated. Conservation efforts. The Polar Bear Agreement, 1973, signed by several Arctic nations, is aimed at protecting polar bears and regulating hunting. In addition, various NGOs and researchers are working to better understand polar bear behavior, population dynamics, and their changing habitats in order to inform conservation strategies. Efforts also include mitigating climate change and protecting key polar bear habitats from industrial development and human disturbance. 6. Climate change impact detailed. Shrinking ice habitat. The Arctic is warming at a rate roughly twice the global average. As sea ice melts, polar bears are left with fewer places to hunt and less time to catch prey. They're being forced to travel further, sometimes leading to exhaustion or starvation. Bears in some regions have been observed to become thinner and less healthy due to the extended fasting periods. Impact on reproduction. The loss of ice also impacts reproduction. Female polar bears require large amounts of fat to successfully gestate and nurse their young. In areas where the ice melts earlier in the season, females may have to venture further for food, putting additional stress on their bodies and reducing their chances of reproductive success. Changing migration patterns. Polar bears' migration routes are also shifting as the ice moves and melts. Bears that once relied on specific migration routes to track seals are now encountering challenges, like open water or more hazardous ice conditions. 7. Role in culture and symbolism detailed. Cultural significance. Indigenous Arctic peoples such as the Inuit have long regarded polar bears as powerful and important animals, incorporating them into their myths and spiritual beliefs. For instance, the Inuit believe that the polar bear has the ability to communicate with spirits, and that hunting them requires respect and ritual. Symbol of climate change. In modern times, the polar bear has become an emblem for the fight against climate change. Environmental organizations use images of the polar bear to raise awareness about the threats posed by global warming and to advocate for the protection of Arctic ecosystems. The image of a lone polar bear stranded on a small piece of ice has become iconic in climate change media campaigns. Let's focus more on conservation efforts and the impacts of climate change on polar bears. Climate change impact on polar bears. Climate change is the most significant and immediate threat to polar bears. As global temperatures rise, the Arctic is experiencing warming at twice the rate of the global average, known as Arctic amplification. This has profound consequences for polar bears and their habitat. 1. Loss of sea ice habitat. Seasonal changes. The main habitat of polar bears' sea ice has been thinning and melting earlier each spring, and forming later in the fall. This dramatically shortens the period when polar bears can hunt seals, which rely on the sea ice to breed and haul out. Habitat fragmentation. In some areas, sea ice is becoming more fragmented, with large areas of open water between chunks of ice. This forces polar bears to travel greater distances to find food, resulting in energy depletion and less time for hunting. In extreme cases, they have to swim long distances across open water, which puts them at risk of drowning or exhaustion. Impact on young bears. Young cubs, born in dens, are particularly vulnerable. The melting ice reduces the area where mother polar bears can give birth to their cubs, and the cubs face increased challenges in learning how to hunt and survive in an environment that is becoming increasingly unpredictable and dangerous. 2. Longer fasting periods. Polar bears rely on sea ice to hunt seals, but as the ice melts earlier in the season, they are forced to fast for longer periods. During summer, when sea ice has mostly melted, polar bears retreat to land. Their food is scarce, and they may have to survive for months without eating, living off their fat stores. However, longer fasting periods lead to malnutrition and thinner bears, making them more susceptible to disease and less capable of reproducing successfully. Studies show that in areas like the southern Beaufort Sea, polar bears are losing weight and having fewer successful pregnancies due to the increased fasting period. 3. Decreased reproductive success. The loss of sea ice impacts the ability of female polar bears to successfully reproduce. They require large fat reserves to sustain themselves through pregnancy, and these reserves also help them nurse their cubs. As their access to food becomes more limited, females are less likely to enter the reproductive cycle, and if they do, the probability of successful births decreases. Additionally, if a mother cannot find enough food, she may abandon her cubs or fail to adequately care for them, leading to higher mortality rates among the cubs. For example, studies have shown that in some regions, cub survival rates have dropped significantly due to food scarcity. Conservation efforts for polar bears. Efforts to conserve polar bears are multifaceted, and they require international cooperation, scientific research, and large-scale action to address both direct and indirect threats. Some key conservation strategies include: 1. Polar bear agreements. The Polar Bear Agreement 1973 was signed by several nations, including Canada, the United States, Alaska, Russia, Greenland, and Norway, to manage and protect polar bear populations. This agreement regulates hunting, trade, and ensures that polar bear populations are monitored and protected across their range. It also calls for research into the effects of environmental changes on polar bear survival. Additionally, CITES, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, has been instrumental in restricting the international trade of polar bear pelts and body parts. 2. Habitat protection. One of the most urgent needs for polar bears is the protection of their critical habitats, especially sea ice. Some conservation organizations, such as the World Wildlife Fund, WWF, have focused on preserving vital areas for polar bear populations, advocating for the establishment of protected marine areas in the Arctic, protecting these areas from oil and gas development, shipping lanes, and other human disturbances is crucial to maintain the integrity of polar bear habitats. In some regions, the designation of Marine Protected Areas, MPAs, can help safeguard feeding and breeding grounds, providing a refuge for polar bears as sea ice disappears. 3. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Since the root cause of the melting ice is global climate change, addressing the larger issue of greenhouse gas emissions is critical for polar bear conservation. This involves international agreements such as the Paris Agreement, aimed at reducing carbon emissions to limit global temperature rise and slowing the rate of ice melt in the Arctic. Scientists and conservationists continue to lobby governments to take more aggressive action on climate change, as maintaining the temperature of the planet below a certain threshold is essential for the survival of polar bears and many other species dependent on ice ecosystems. For monitoring and research, scientists are conducting extensive research to understand polar bear behavior, health, population trends, and the impact of climate change on their survival. By tagging polar bears with GPS collars, researchers track their movements, helping to identify crucial areas for protection. Research also focuses on the physical health of polar bears, measuring their body condition, reproductive rates, and the effects of environmental changes. This data is essential for shaping conservation policies and understanding the long-term outlook for polar bear populations. 5. Public awareness and education. Raising awareness about the plight of polar bears is another important aspect of conservation efforts. Many organizations, such as the Polar Bears International (PBI), work to educate the public about the impacts of climate change on polar bear populations. Through campaigns, educational outreach, and media engagement, these groups aim to increase understanding and motivate action to reduce carbon footprints and support climate policies that protect the Arctic ecosystem. Ecotourism also plays a role in conservation by promoting responsible travel to polar bear habitats. Ecotourism provides financial incentives to protect the environment, as well as education on the importance of conservation. 6. Adaptation strategies. In some regions where polar bears are already facing the impacts of ice loss, local communities and wildlife authorities are considering adaptation strategies. These include creating safe corridors for polar bears to move between different ice regions, reducing human-wildlife conflict, as polar bears venture closer to human settlements in search of food, through measures like bear-proofing communities and building protective enclosures around human infrastructure, supporting sustainable hunting practices by indigenous communities, which can contribute to better polar bear management without compromising populations. Challenges in the road ahead. Despite these efforts, the challenge of conserving polar bears remains daunting. The most significant hurdle is addressing climate change, which requires global cooperation and immediate action to reduce carbon emissions. While local conservation efforts can provide immediate relief, the overarching issue of global warming and its impact on the Arctic remains the greatest threat to polar bears' survival. In addition to addressing climate change, the continued protection of polar bear habitats and the reduction of human-induced threats will require long-term international commitment and a focus on sustainable environmental practices. In conclusion, polar bears are truly at a crossroads, where the combination of habitat loss, human-wildlife conflict, and climate change threatens their very existence. But through continued research, conservation efforts, and global action on climate change, there's hope that polar bears can continue to thrive in the wild for generations to come.